Canada-U.S. trade negotiation news that we want to head over to our nation's capital, where the CBC's Katie Simpson is standing by right now. Okay, so there is some news here to report, Katie. You've spoken to some sources. What can you tell us?
Yeah, for the first time, we're getting a snapshot as to what is happening behind closed doors when it comes to those high and very high stakes talks between Canada and the United States as Donald Trump's tariff threat, his latest tariff threat, sort of looms over this country. A couple of things before I get into the specific details we need to say. All of the information I'm about to share is according to two industry sources that CBC News is granting anonymity to in order to discuss sensitive ongoing negotiations. And the Globe and Mail was first to report on the details of these conversations. But CBC News has been able to match the story, but also in addition add some more details and some more context to what's going on here. So we're finally starting to get a sense of what specifically the Canadians are asking for and what the Canadians are willing to give up in order to sort of ease this ongoing trade war. We are told, according to two industry sources, that Canada is willing to make some changes when it comes to the alcohol bans to meet the American demands to remove to ban American booze on Canadian shelves. Also willing to meet some demands when it comes to lifting tariffs on the auto sector and making some changes when it comes to the dairy sector. However, not anything to do with the dismantling of supply management. That remains a firm thing that the Canadian government is not going to be changing, but willing to meet some American demands when it comes to quota systems and how dairy is sort of viewed in Canadian shelves. But the big headline out of that really nasty sticking point that the Americans don't like, the Canadians have indicated to the Americans that they are willing to give up on those booze bans if they get something in exchange. Now, what are the Canadians pushing for? What we are told, again, according to these two industry sources, is the main thing Canada is pushing for in this moment. They do not want those new tariffs, the 50% tariffs on some Canadian goods that are set to come into effect on August 19th. Those cannot come into effect. And it has been expressed to the Americans that is sort of viewed as a make or break moment. If the Americans go ahead and put those new tariffs on, there will be no political space in Canada to get back to any sort of negotiations. That will be a very difficult pill for Canadians to swallow, and there won't be the political appetite to sort of engage in that way. The other thing the Canadians are seeking for are lower tariff rates when it comes to those sectoral tariffs on steel, on aluminum, on the lumber industry, those kinds of tariffs. They're called 232 tariffs. The Canadians are looking for lower rates, the best rate of any country in the world at this point, because the Americans have said to the Canadians, under no circumstance will there be no tariff when it comes to that. As long as President Donald Trump is the president, there are going to be these kinds of tariffs. So Canada is seeking a better rate, a lower rate. And that's something that they're pushing for. Another thing the Canadians have asked for is they want a joint statement so that when the joint statement saying Canada and the U.S., they are going to be pushing ahead with those CUSMA review talks in a formal way. Remember, Mexico and the United States, they have been holding formal negotiations to ensure the free trade agreement between all three countries remains in place. It's sort of in a state of limbo right now as it's sort of reviewed and all countries are deciding what they're going to do next. Canada wants to remain in the deal. It wants to keep the United States in that deal. And so one thing that Canada wants in this moment is that the Americans to come out and say, alongside the Canadians, that yes, we are going to push ahead. We're going to get that review, those formal negotiations related to the trade deal underway. So again, this is sort of the first sort of snapshot that we've seen here. We're also told that Canadian and American officials have agreed to have some form of contact every day between now and August 19th. Not necessarily the highest sort of people involved in the negotiations, but there's going to be daily contact. We already know that Dominic LeBlanc is going back to Washington next week. We're hearing that Ambassador Greer, who is his American counterpart, the top person on trade, that he's open to meetings when it comes to next week. But again, this is the first time we've sort of gotten some insight into what Canada is willing to do, what Canada is really pushing for. The big headline out of this is sort of the concessions Canada appears to be willing to sort of put on the table in order to get something in exchange for that. It has to do with the booze bans. It has to do with the way that dairy quotas are looked at, not a dismantling of supply management. We just need to make that very explicitly clear. And then some tariffs that retaliatory tariffs Canada has imposed related to the auto sector. Canada is willing to sort of pull back and meet some American demands related to those in order to make sure those 50% tariffs don't come into effect on August 19th, to get those NAFTA or those CUSMA negotiations back on track, and to get some sectoral tariff relief when it comes to steel, aluminum, and lumber. So we'll have more on this on Power and Politics. I'm filling in for our wonderful colleague, David Cochran, and the reporting we've done is based on sources that I've spoken with. My colleague Kate McKenna here in the Ottawa Bureau has spoken with. So we will continue to follow this. I'm sure we'll have plenty of reaction throughout the day, but you can get a full write-up. We're going to put it up on CBC.ca.
Thank you so much for this, Katie. You know, I do have one additional question for you, if you don't mind, since I have you here. So, of course, when you're working and you're having these conversations with your sources, and we're talking about some of the potential concessions that could be on the table, we certainly know that as part of the schedule that was in place when Dominic LeBlanc and Janice Charette were meeting with Jameson Greer, they were also hosting sort of meetings with provincial counterparts and with their advisory council as well. So one would imagine that this was a conversation that came up. We saw when the premiers met just a few weeks ago, we saw Premier David Eby say there's no way in hell we're putting booze back on the shelf. We heard Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, have a very similar strong message. How contentious might this be? How challenging might this be if this is something on the table? Must they have all of the cooperation of the premiers? Because it's a provincial decision here, one would imagine.
Yeah, so it is a provincial decision, and we've heard those very strong words from premiers who are saying we're not in a position right now to remove this, but this is part of the negotiation process. So I think that we're gonna. It's just going to be about getting reaction and see what people have to say about this. You know, this is information that we have learned and other Canadian news outlets have learned based on industry sources, and so but we do know that there were briefing meetings that took place yesterday. So this information is sort of making its way through the system to whether it's premiers' offices, whether it's to industry stakeholders, wherever it goes. And so it's getting reaction to see what the appetite is for that and where it goes from here. And guess what? We'll be doing that on Power and Politics coming up at 5 o'clock Eastern on this network. So we will have all of the reaction and including some provincial reaction. And I don't want to say who's coming on, but because I just want to make sure it's confirmed before I just go on air and say it. But we will have some provincial reaction, hopefully to get a better sense of what some of the provinces that do have alcohol bans, what they're thinking in this moment. But of course, that sort of is, you know, what is it that Canada is willing to do in this moment to try and achieve some of its outcomes? This is a negotiation. So this is kind of what happens. We're just getting our first sort of snapshot into it right now.
Some very interesting developments there. Katie, as always, thank you so much for joining us and for breaking that news for us. That is the CBC's Katie Simpson.